Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Sandeep Mazumdar. I'm the Dean of the Business School here, and we're just happy to have you. We're very delighted to have Greg Lukianoff with us today from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, and we'll learn lots about what he's doing and some of his opinions on campus conformity. Actually, maybe it's a good time for me to exit. He's just talking about campus conformity. Just kidding. But Dr. Klein, who's our chair of the Department for Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation, is going to come up and give a full bio for Greg. Fuller bio.
Thanks. Thank you, Dean Mazumdar. We're not sure which side of the conformity gauntlet you're on to know how we feel about that introduction. But yeah, thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. My name is Peter Klein. I'm a professor in the entrepreneurship department here in the business school and also the academic director of the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise, which is the sponsor of tonight's event. We're very pleased to have Greg Lukianoff with us tonight, and he's going to talk about a number of issues related to free speech and free impression. His lecture is titled The Campus Conformity Gauntlet, and I'm sure he'll explain a little bit more about the meaning behind that title in just a second. So this lecture series, it's called the Free Enterprise Forum, and we host distinguished visitors from outside Baylor, from all over the world, to come and speak on important social, economic, policy issues of the day. Now, when you hear the term free enterprise, you probably think of that in a business and markets context, right? It refers to, businesses being able to engage in economic activity without undue constraint from external parties, from state regulation, intervention, and so forth. But here at Baylor, we interpret free enterprise as sort of part of a broad set of different kinds of freedoms or freedoms in different areas, including political freedom or political liberty, religious freedom, and of course, freedom of expression. And Greg and his organization, FIRE, are among the leading advocates for freedom of expression at university campuses. So Greg is the president and CEO of FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. For some of you old-timers might remember, there was a different name when the organization was founded. It was, make sure I get it right, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They very cleverly rebranded as Free Expression, Individual Rights and Expression, so they could keep the same acronym and they don't have to make new t-shirts or anything. They still say FIRE, so that's sort of a genius move. FIRE is the nation's leading organization in defense of free expression, especially on university campuses. FIRE does so with an extensive program of activities, campus events, speeches, publications, but also legal advocacy representing faculty, staff, and students in dealing with legal issues related to free speech at universities. Greg, besides his leadership of FIRE, is also an attorney and a New York Times best-selling author of a number of books, including Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship, and the End of American Debate, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus, which some of you may have seen. We'll talk a little bit later, maybe in the Q&A, about where Baylor University stands in the free speech rankings. We actually are kind of not in the standard list. We have a little asterisk because of our religious mission, and we may talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A. A lot of you may recognize Greg's name from his best-selling book, co-authored with Jonathan Haidt, called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. That's one of the books that brought campus free speech issues to the forefront of public discussion when it came out, what, 10 years ago?
2018.
2018, yeah. And so Greg is going to talk to us tonight about the Campus Conformity Gauntlet, and his speech will draw on some ideas from his newest book, which is co-authored with Rikki Schlott and called The Canceling of the American Mind, How Cancel Culture Undermines Trust and Threatens Us All, But There Is a Solution. So we're going to learn tonight about cancel culture, the problems therein, and the potential solutions. So please join me in welcoming Greg Lukianoff here to Baylor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Is this, yeah, okay, that's on, great. Let's get my slides up. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I haven't been back to Waco in a long time. I did a talk at Baylor maybe, 12 years ago or something like that. But it looks, done a lot of building since I was here last. So the Conformity Gauntlet. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is I am the weird lawyer who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. I wanted to defend freedom of speech for my career, and I'm very lucky that I've gotten to do that. I hyper-specialized in First Amendment classes. When I was in law school, I took every class that Stanford offered on the First Amendment. When I ran out of it, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. It's something of my own design about the history of freedom of speech. And I interned at the ACLU of Northern California. But nothing really prepared me for how easy it was to get in trouble for what you said on campus, even way back in 2001. And it's gotten a lot worse over the years. So in this book, in my latest book, Canceling the American Mind, I try to layer the threats to free speech, to free thought, what I call conformity-inducing pressures on top of each other. Because I think that if you just hear about the individual outrageous case, honestly, given the age of a lot of you, they probably don't even see an outrageous to you anymore, the same way they used to us. Like one case of a professor, a tenured professor losing their job for even highly offensive speech was considered really outrageous 10, 15 years ago. Now it's such a common occurrence that I'm sure that a lot of you, don't think all that much about it. And that of itself is a problem. So in order to really show what's gone wrong in higher ed, one of the things we do in Canceling the American Mind, my co-author is a Gen Z young woman named Rikki Schlott. It was given Coddling in the American Mind was so much about threats faced by young women, it was really nice to be able to co-author something with someone who knew this from her own personal experience. We try to show what these threats show when you look like when you layer them on top of each other. So the Conformity Gauntlet chapter starts out with a little bit of a thought experiment. Like imagine you're an independent-minded high schooler who longs to be a famous scientist one day. And in some ways, I'm making this exercise for older people to kind of get a sense of how many different sort of hoops you have to jump through in order to go to a lot of schools these days. And we make the point, get through high school without getting in trouble for your opinion, which now that FIRE has expanded our mission, we know happens all the time. Submit DEI statements as part of college admission application process to a hostile administration. I'll explain more what I mean about that. Get through undergraduate education without being canceled, without internalizing the message that you don't belong. Submit DEI statements part of PhD programs and master's programs. And it's submitting your application process to an even more hostile audience. This all comes out in the data. Get through PhD program without being canceled or without having deeply internalized self-censorship. Avoid the efficient rhetorical fortress from the right and targeting from the right. Get through student teaching without being canceled, virtually no protections. Submit DEI statements as part of faculty employment application process to a completely opaque system. Earn tenure, likely submitting yet another DEI statement as part of the process without being canceled. Survive a career in higher ed despite the dramatically weakened job security offered by tenure. It offers very little. Nature and Scientific American probably still won't publish your work if they don't like what you find, even if it's impeccably researched. And get disinvited, shouted down just the same. So I wanted to just, while I'm going through this, to give examples of real and recent FIRE cases. This is a case at Emerson College in Massachusetts. This is a student who was told that she was anti-Asian racist because she handed out these stickers that said, "China kinda sus." And for older people, that means suspicious. And it's even got the hammer and sickle on there. It's clearly about the Chinese Communist Party, about the nation of China. But because some students complained, this student, who herself is Asian American, was told that she was guilty of anti-Asian hate and suspended at Emerson College. And these are very normal cases, the kind of stuff we see every day. Got it. And so I mentioned DEI statements a lot. Now, there are lots of different ways you can have statements that would have the same kind of political litmus test problems as DEI statements. They wouldn't necessarily have to call themselves DEI statements. So for example, if you had someone applying for a professorship back during the Red Scare and you asked them their thoughts on patriotism, you wouldn't have to, think real hard to realize that there'd be no way to evaluate someone's commitment to patriotism without evaluating their politics. So I think that when people are asked to show their commitment to DEI and to show things about their various levels of ideology, that obviously that's a political litmus test. Obviously, it can only be evaluated according to whether or not the people reading your application approve of your politics. But even though I consider this a fairly obvious fact, we even did an experiment to find out whether or not, we also did polling, whether or not requiring DEI statements are political litmus tests, things that will discriminate against people with quote unquote the wrong points of view. 90% of conservatives believe they are political litmus tests, and that 90% is right. I'm kind of surprised that there's 10% that didn't think that. 56% of moderates, and even 50% of professors overall thought these were political litmus tests. And we did an experiment where we got 3,600 professors to evaluate various versions of DEI statements. I would say 4 of them included arguing for religious diversity, another one arguing for 4 of them included religious diversity, viewpoint diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and then the final one actually was basically just identity politics as currently sort of defined on sort of left-leaning campuses. So all the other ones talked about other kinds of diversity. The final one talked about it in terms of intersectionality and anti-racism. And the experiment didn't really surprise us very much, but it showed that the only one that would have gotten you hired by most professors was the one that was completely ideologically rigid. Arguing about viewpoint diversity wouldn't get you hired. Arguing about religious diversity certainly wouldn't get you hired. And the one that broke my heart the most is arguing about socioeconomic diversity wouldn't get you hired either. And that to me is outrageous because so many of these schools, the kind of diversity that they're lacking most severely is actually economic diversity. So we even showed in an experiment that these are political litmus tests. We've actually sponsored legislation banning political litmus tests in higher ed, and we're very clear that we would just as much oppose, the loyalty oaths, the patriotism oaths that you saw in the 1950s and the modern versions that you see today that require you to show if you have approved points of view. This is an old slide. 46% of large institutions surveyed by the AUP already use DEI criteria and tenure standards. And now it's something like 3/4 of them use this, and again, political litmus test. And one of the most shocking things we found in our polling was that we asked professors whether or not they thought DEI statements were political litmus tests, and we asked them if they thought they were appropriate. What we weren't expecting to find was 23% of professors actually said, yes, they're political litmus tests, and they're appropriate, which was just like, okay, that's at least, you're not lying to yourself about what you think. 76% of faculty applicants to UC Berkeley's Life Sciences Department were limited solely on the basis of their diversity statements. This was a fact that came out after the fact. I wish we'd known that in advance, because that would have been a lovely lawsuit to have. And keep in mind what this means. People in the life sciences didn't even make it to an interview with a scientist, because administrators, DEI administrators, decided that their essay, their political essay, was not to their liking. Here's another example from Yale. This is a student who was, his bar membership was threatened. He was provided with a pre-made apology. His legal career at Yale Law School was threatened because in an email to get together the Student Multicultural Association groups, he used the phrase trap house, which is slang for a place where people go smoke pot. And apparently the argument was that since that term initially started as black slang decades ago, that it was offensive for Trent to use that, and therefore his career should be ruined. We decided to get involved in this case, brought some attention to it. We were able to help the student. But the idea that the administrator involved in this case, or the administrators involved in this case, continue to create havoc at Yale, and they seem to be unfireable, despite trying to blackmail a student into signing a pre-written apology for something he had no need to apologize for. This is Kimberly Day at University of Tennessee. This is a case that, this is a lawsuit that Fire brought. This is one that I just find incredibly funny. So Kimberly Day is a pharmacy student. She was at a master's program for pharmacy. And she also has an Instagram account where she had a lot of posts talking about Cardi B, and in some cases citing some of Cardi B's racier lyrics. And she was told that she was suspended from the pharmacy program because apparently that was behavior unbecoming of pharmacist. And I think this through, like the idea of going to CVS and being kind of like, no. Do you like edgy hip hop? I don't want my, tramadol from you today. It just seems manifestly ridiculous. And it's a case we actually end up losing, and this is something that universities do all the time, is that they find that if the student has graduated, they can make the argument then that it's mooted. It's no longer a valid lawsuit. So universities get away with this kind of stuff all the time, and we're appealing this case, but these are hard cases to fight, and universities have gotten used to getting away with strong-arm tactics like this. Now this stat we were impressed by, because 22% of faculty willing to explicitly discriminate against a Trump supporter. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Most people are self-deceptive. They don't think they would do this. And an even larger number of people who would do this wouldn't admit to it. These are 22% of faculty were proudly willing to admit that they would discriminate against a Trump supporter in hiring, which should give you an idea of how many of them actually would, even if they weren't willing to own it or say it so proudly. And 1/3 of liberal California university faculty at least somewhat willing to discriminate against a conservative in hiring, and again, willing to admit to it in polling. 49% of graduate students endorsed ousting a faculty member who expressed conservative views. 49%. We did some interesting polling for through our faculty network, asking students when they called the bias-related incident program line when they were reporting their professors for offensive speech, what kind of speech were they talking about? And we wanted to figure out, was it rude words? Was it bad framing? Like, what was it? It was overwhelmingly opinions they didn't agree with. And an awful lot of schools in the country have bias-related hotlines. My co-author, Rikki Schlott, she actually had her bias-related hotline number on the back of her student ID right below 911 and fire and police. And these are ways to secretly report your professors and friends for offensive speech, by which they mean disapproved opinions. And this is why we call it the conformity gauntlet. We're talking about all the different levels at which you're facing pressure. So like the idea of being a independent-minded young professor and knowing that any one of you in this room could turn you in for wrongthink, what's that going to do to the vibrancy of ideas and of discussion? And it's going to chill it. And that also comes out very much in our polling, is that professors are afraid of their students, and students are afraid of each other. They're a little bit afraid of their professors as well. It's overall sounds like a fully unpleasant environment. 56% of philosophy department faculty at least occasionally willing to discriminate against conservatives in hiring. That was impressive. Oh, and this is a story of some of the worst moments from cancel culture. Now I realize I don't have a slide in here that explains what I mean by cancel culture. Now, I knew I took a little bit of a risk by titling my follow-up to Coddling the American Mind, the canceling of the American mind, because there are people out there who hate the term cancel culture. They just hate it. Honestly, me and Rikki don't like it all that much either. But we did our polling, and we discovered that black or white, liberal or conservative, it's the term that people understand for something weird that started happening around 10 years ago, is that a lot of people started losing their jobs for opinions that they had, for cracking jokes, for saying things online, etc., at a way that just wasn't normal in American history. And so our definition of cancel culture is very simply the uptick of campaigns to get people fired, deplatformed, expelled, etc., for opinions that would be protected under the First Amendment. We say would be in part because we're talking about realms outside of the public sphere, like corporations, etc. But we use First Amendment standards because they bring a lot of nuance to it. We even go a little deeper in the book and explain that we're using this as an analogy to public employee law, which brings even more common sense into the analysis, but in a relatively short definition, and the culture of fear that resulted from this. And it wasn't subtle in 2014 when we started seeing these changes. It was very dramatic. Students used to be the best constituency for free speech on campus. Suddenly, right around the end of 2013, going into 2014, they were demanding deplatforming of speakers, they were demanding new speech codes, they were demanding microaggression policies. All of these speech restrictions that students just a couple of years before would have actually fought against, suddenly they're very much for. And the worst year that we saw for professor cancellations in our history up to that point was 2020. And we thought that was going to be a quiet year because everything was closed due to COVID, but we were very, very wrong. And Mike Adams was a professor that I'd known since my first days at FIRE. My first days at FIRE were right after 9/11. I spent a lot of time getting lots of hate mail for defending students and faculty who basically said things like, America had 9/11 coming, and I'm a First Amendment lawyer. Like, I've got no problem defending people for offensive speech. But I'm also willing to defend people like Mike Adams, who when a student said that 9/11 was entirely America's own fault, he wrote back, she wrote to the entire university listserv, and he wrote back saying, your speech is protected and it should be, just like bigoted low information speech is. And he got investigated for this because apparently this was offensive, to the student. And I was brand new at FIRE. I just started as legal director, just a couple months before, and I was mad. I was really mad about this case, that they were going into his email, they were looking into what he had done, what he meant by saying this was bigoted. And there was no question that this was protected. This is at University of North Carolina, at Wilmington. It's protected speech. And meanwhile, as far as the intensity of the case, I would discover this was like a 3 out of 10, in terms of like how bad cases I would see. But we got involved. We weren't able to get the investigation stopped, but the university didn't fire Mike. And they, might have wished they had, because after that incident, he always attributed to me that when I was fighting on his behalf, I had recommended a book I was reading, a book called How to Talk Dirty and Influence People by the great comedian Lenny Bruce. And he read it, and he said, you know what, I really have to be more in people's face. I've got to be funnier, I've got to be edgier, I've got to be all these things. And I was like, oh man, what have I done here? And I'm more left-leaning. Mike was someone who came into school very much like me, came into as a criminology professor at UNCW, but then became an evangelical Christian. And so he became very socially conservative. And he became a little bit of a gadfly at UNCW over the years. But his style was always in your face, but it was always jokey. It was always clear he was kidding. It was always clear that he was basically trying to do the same thing that like left-leaning comedians do to the right all the time, but in the other direction. And they tried to get rid of him multiple times. In the course of trying to not give him promotion, what happened to him was that he actually went to court to take on an interpretation of a Supreme Court case called Garcetti v. Ceballos that UNCW was trying to argue meant that there were great limitations on the free speech rights even of tenured professors. And because he went into court to challenge that, Mike actually defeated that interpretation of Garcetti v. Ceballos for the entire Fourth Circuit. So people for Virginia and North Carolina, and like for 4 states in the union, like they have Mike to thank for why they actually have greater academic freedom protections than other parts of the country. But in 2020, he cracked a joke on Twitter likening the lockdowns to slavery. And this is the way this was the joke that he said. He had a picture of him at another state with a bunch of his friends at a bar, and he said, Massa, government, whoever the governor of North Carolina was at the time, let my people go. This is a joke out of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I mean, and this, however, was interpreted as reason to get rid of Mike. Students started protesting, students started coming to his house, and he was talked into agreeing to a severance deal in order to get to leave UNCW. Now, of course, the school realized they had to settle with him because he previously defeated the school in a lawsuit. They didn't want to lose that much money again. And meanwhile, 2020 was a crazy year for professor cancellations. I'd never seen anything like it. We saw more case submissions in June of 2020 than we would see in entire years at FIRE when FIRE was smaller. And I thought that Mike would be fine because Mike was very confident. He always seemed very happy, very, very unflappable. And so I didn't check in with Mike until many weeks down the road to see how he was doing because we were just completely overwhelmed. And I will always regret that because when I checked in with him in mid-July, he was saying, listen, I panicked when I took the severance deal. Is there anything I can do, legally speaking? I'm like, probably not, Mike. Like, you signed it. Like, I'm sorry I didn't check in earlier, but you could have asked me, like, if you should have. And he said that people were still coming to his house. People were still calling him on the phone. They were threatening his wife and children. He didn't have wife and children, by the way, but these very nice and very, high-minded protesters were, threatening the wife and kids that he didn't have. And he was in a bad state. I'd never actually heard Mike like that. And he killed himself the next week. And that really, it's not the first person, I've helped who killed himself later on, but that was definitely like the clearest causation in terms of cancellation and being responsible for, someone's death. And to be clear, there is also cancel culture from the right, and we talk about this in the book. We fight it all the time at FIRE, and this is one where, and I will be honest that sometimes the level of offensiveness that people on the left can get away with before they get in trouble is a little bit higher sometimes than what people on the right sometimes can, given that universities tend to be much more, most universities tend to be much more left-leaning. But this case still bothers me. So this was also this was in 2020, but before COVID. And this was a situation where Donald Trump had said in a standoff with Iran that he'd be willing to attack cultural sites, cultural heritage sites in Iran. Now, that's a war crime. That's a big deal to actually sort of lightly say that you're going to actually attack cultural sites. And I started reading all of these headlines from Fox News, for example. Todd Starnes, someone I don't have a lot of respect for, wrote an article, making it sound like there's this unscrupulous university professor who's advising the Ayatollah of Iran about where to attack in the United States. And he was immediately fired for this because, you know, he's helping a foreign dictator attack the US. And then it turned out this was all about this tweet. In retaliation, Ayatollah Khomeini, you should tweet a list of 52 sites of beloved American cultural heritage that he would bomb. Mall of America, Kardashian residence. There's literally a Kardashian joke in there. It's obviously a joke. Everyone, and I always show the actual tweet because it's kind of like, is there any question? I mean, this is a Middle Eastern studies professor. He knows the Ayatollah Khomeini is long dead, and he made a joke that actually I thought was actually not even that bad of a joke. And he lost his job and was never invited back. Still out of a job to this day, to my knowledge, for something that was just badly misinterpreted in the media and on purpose, in my opinion. And there are laws that have happened in recent years as well that we have gone to court to fight. The Stop Woke Act was a law that Florida passed, that DeSantis passed in Florida, where it was trying to eliminate entire topics from being taught and from being discussed on college campuses in Florida. Now, this led to a situation where we, first we told Florida, this is unconstitutional, it will be laughed out of court. Then when they passed it, we're like, okay, we're gonna sue, and you're gonna lose, and it's gonna be laughed out of court. We sued, and this is what the people defending the law had to go into court and argue. Under this law, university students and professors could argue against affirmative action in class, but they couldn't argue for it. And it's like, okay, that's admitting it's unconstitutional. Like it's basically just saying it plain and simple. You're saying some viewpoints are prohibited, and therefore you're going to lose. And guess what? They lost in this case. So we have seen, even from people who see some of the same problems on campus, if you're going to try to fix a problem, you better come up with a constitutional solution. Now, back to the conformity gauntlet. One thing that has been getting steadily worse, and is the worst it's ever been, because it gets a little bit worse every year, sometimes a lot worse, is the lack of viewpoint diversity in higher ed. And it's particularly bad in elite higher ed. This is a snapshot of most departments, their ratio of liberal to conservative at Harvard. It's 88-1. That's a problem. I didn't actually fully appreciate this as being a problem until I started reading a lot of things with my eventual co-author, Jonathan Haidt, understanding what happens if you have a lack of viewpoint diversity in a community. If you have an 88-1 ratio, it's very easy to start to think that, well, you know, decent people agree with me, smart people agree with me, stupid and evil people, they don't agree with me. Those people are other, those people are wrong. And that's a phenomenon called group polarization, which tends to get worse the lower level of viewpoint diversity you actually have. And what's amazing about this 88-1 is that when you look at actually even the conservative professors at a lot of these schools, including Harvard, they tend to be the older professors who are, you know, not much, you know, not long for this world, not necessarily going to die, but going to retire. And sometimes they exist entirely in centers that have very little interaction with the rest of the university. So like this number is not, it's actually worse. So when it comes to the things that create conformity-inducing pressures, one thing is social pressure, like the idea of like, do you really want to be the weirdo who is stupid and wrong in this environment? Particularly when there's a possibility you might actually get punished, you might actually not get hired, or you might just be setting yourself up for scorn and being reviled. And by the way, one of the best known conservative professors at Harvard is Harvey Mansfield, and there's hardly a year that goes by that some student doesn't try to get that guy fired. And why would you want to put up with this? And just to give an idea of what this is in historical comparison, there was a study of whether or not students, about the McCarthyism, the Second Red Scare, done right towards the end of McCarthyism in 1957. And it reviewed, how many professors were punished for being communist. It was about 62. Overall, how many were punished for political belief of some kind? It was about 100. I actually think the numbers are probably a little bit less. I think that that there were ones that came to light later, so probably probably somewhat more over time. But they also did a survey of professors asking them if they'd been self-censoring. And during the height of McCarthyism, the survey came back with 9% of professors saying that they were watering down, they were watching what they wrote in papers. And that's really bad. 9%, like it's almost 1 in 10 professors saying that they're self-censoring to some degree in papers. So that means, yeah, people were aware that there were some things you shouldn't be saying at that point, and that they're acting accordingly. When we repeated this exact question, we got about 34% of professors said they were self-censoring in papers. But then when we asked in social media, in class, in publications, or online, we got 91% of professors said that. So a lot of times when people point out kind of like, oh, but is cancel culture really that bad in terms of self-censorship? I mean, when you're 9% away from complete of everybody saying they're self-censoring, that's about as bad as it can get. 16% of professors say that they have been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their speech, teaching, or academic research. Now, 16% say they've been threatened with discipline or actually disciplined. Like, that's insane. Like, the 9% they were just saying they were self-censoring. These are people who are actually saying that they've been, there's been power used against them. And I remember I said about 100 professors, were fired for their beliefs during McCarthyism. McCarthyism was about 11 years. It was 1947 to 1957. If you extrapolate this outward, this is 92,000 professors say they've either been threatened with punishment or actually punished for their speech, teaching, or academic research. There's nothing like this anywhere that I'm familiar with in history. 29% of professors say that they've been pressured by administrators to avoid controversial research. That's 152,000 if extrapolated out. Again, nothing comparable to this. There are literally secret hearings as well. Now this one sounds conspiratorial. This is Laura Kipnis. She wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education, one of the most important publications for administrators in higher ed. And in it, she made the point that Title IX administrators, an interpretation of Title IX, was actually being weaponized against student speech and faculty speech. And this is true. This is something that FIRE can attest to. We've known this for years. There are literally secret hearings for people involved in Title IX claims. Now, sometimes that's about actual people actually hitting on students, for example, and that's something that would be considered harassment, and understandably so. But also, many times, it's purely about speech. And as if simply to prove this, she wrote this article, and then what happens to Laura Kipnis? She is suddenly under investigation for Title IX, for violating Title IX for writing this article at Northwestern University. The hearing is, of course, secret. She can't know who is charging her. She can't know what the charges are. She lets this go on for 72 days, finding out a little bit more about what the charges are. She still doesn't know who the students are. She's told she can't talk to anyone about the hearing. She is told that she can't have a lawyer present. All of the normal due process protections, none of them are there. And what Laura did that I really appreciate is that she, 72 days in, wrote something for the Chronicle of Higher Education saying, guess what happened after I reported on secret hearings that come from Title IX? And amazingly, and kind of unsurprisingly, once she took this public, Northwestern ended the Title IX hearing almost immediately. But the story's not over. She wrote a book called Unwanted Advances, which was about this secret sort of labyrinth of hearings that you'll never hear about. And she's not the only person who's written about this. Ann Applebaum at The Atlantic has also written about it as well. And of course, once she published the book, she was once again brought up in charges of violating Title IX at Northwestern University. In terms of cases that we know about, and we know that that's only the tip of the iceberg, we keep a Scholars Under Fire database where we keep track of professors getting punished and getting targeted. Professors being targeted is the key to really know how a liberal the situation is, because if you have a school where consistently students are signing petitions to get you fired for your speech, that's a problem. That is a conformity-inducing pressure. That is a illiberal environment. And like I said, it was about 100 professors fired during McCarthyism. As of last summer, we had found about more than 1,000 professors targeted for their speech or their research or their teaching for a speech that would be protected. We found that about 2/3 of those were punished in some way, and about 200 of them were fired. Again, twice as many of the ones we know of during the heyday of McCarthyism. And when it comes to, 1/6, that's another way of saying the 16% data that we had before. Carol Hooven is a professor at Harvard. Has anybody heard of Carol Hooven? Raise your hands if you have. Okay, so Carol Hooven, I actually know Carol. She was a professor at Harvard. She was a professor at Harvard. She is an evolutionary biologist. She wrote a great book called Testosterone, called T, and she was talking about her book on TV. She said that when it comes to a lot of issues around gender, and when it comes to things like trans issues, that we should be compassionate towards trans people, that we should use their pronouns, we should generally be as compassionate as we can be, but we can't pretend biological sex isn't real. We can't do that and still be good scientists. And she was immediately targeted by the head of the DEI task force at Harvard. Students started signing petitions to get her in trouble. They refused to work her class. Harvard didn't have her back. The only people who did actually have her back were professors like Steven Pinker, who's on our advisory council, and Jeffrey Flyer, who's part of Heterodox Academy. But eventually, the atmosphere was so hostile that Carol sort of dropped out of Harvard. It just wasn't worth it anymore for being targeted like that. She knew that if she did anything wrong, she would be fired immediately. And she's absolutely right. That is exactly what would have happened to her. And I always make the point that this is very sad for Harvard because they lost a great professor. The book T is excellent. It's just top-notch popular nonfiction writing. But it's also really bad for the expert class because people aren't stupid. And when they see people debating about, is biological sex a spectrum or is it binary, and they see that a Harvard professor got pushed out of Harvard because she said that biological sex is real, they're never going to believe you again on this topic. They're going to say, listen, even if, why should I trust you? You wouldn't even tell me what, the incentives are so skewed in favor of coming to any answer but Carol's. Why should I listen to you? And this is one of the things we really try to stress in Canceling the American Mind. All these conformity-inducing pressures are destroying our universe of shared facts. Because when people know that 1 out of 88 professors are conservative and they face pressures to conform all the time, when they know that they have to file DEI statements to actually show their ideological fealty, when they know professor after professor has actually gotten in trouble or fired or otherwise had their lives ruined or killed themselves for having the wrong opinion, they won't trust you to be objective on what you find, and they shouldn't trust you. And nature, human behavior. This one just blew me away. Now, in a statement entitled "Science Must Respect the Dignity and Rights of All Humans," Nature, Human Behavior, which is, and the company that actually that publishes Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the country, came out with a statement saying that we will consider not publishing things that can be shown to be harmful to groups if we think, in our opinion, it might actually be harmful to groups. Now, this was one of these things it was amazing that you had to sort of slow it down and explain it. Okay, have you noticed how many existing conformity-inducing pressures there are? So what you're saying now is that is that even if you make it all the way through all this stuff and you have some research that's really well researched, but it says something that is unpopular with the kind of people who who graduate from Harvard, that you are leaving it out there that you won't necessarily publish it if you think, in your opinion, it's harmful in some way. And this is why science is undermining its own credibility on a lot of this stuff. Because it's like, yeah, no, like you're stacking the deck so far in your favor that they're just not going to trust you on any hot button issue ever again. We had an article written by Jonathan Haidt, the guy who wrote Kindly Inquisitors and the Constitution of Knowledge, explaining like why this is so epistemically arrogant, as in this is the kind of behavior that science is not supposed to allow. That essentially, like, you follow the science where it goes, and if it says something that you don't like or aren't comfortable with, doesn't mean it's not true. And we have seen campus shoutdowns all over the country. This is the deplatforming attempts that we've seen in the past year. So 2023 was the worst year for deplatforming that we're familiar with. We have a great research department at FIRE. I'm very proud of the amount of data we've been able to put together. And my alma mater, Stanford, we had a shout down from a Fifth Circuit judge. About 1/5 of the school showed up to shout down this Fifth Circuit judge because he was a Trump appointee and they didn't like some of his decisions. Kristen Wagner at Yale, same thing. Riley Gaines at San Francisco State University. And so last year, among deplatforming, we include professors, speakers who are disinvited from giving talks on campus, but also we include things like shout downs or physically barring people from attending speeches. We consider that heckler's vetoes to also be a form of deplatforming. And last year was the worst year we'd ever seen for deplatforming in the United States. And this year is going to blow it out of the water. There has been nonstop shout downs on campus. I think the biggest number we saw last year, we're probably gonna double it next year, if not more. And yeah, that's the deplatforming database. And if you'll notice, the number of professor cancellations actually started to dip a couple years ago, but only getting back down to how bad it was maybe like 6 years ago, which is still really, really bad. But that's partially because eventually you run out of witches to burn, and once you do, you can get the other people. When you have to sort of get viewpoint diversity from off campus, you can also stop them, and sometimes by shouting them down, sometimes by violence, sometimes by getting them disinvited. And as far as depressing things that I've seen, FIRE is a genuinely nonpartisan organization, and since October 7th, we have defended a lot of pro-Palestinian speech on campus. And it was weird, though, to see a bunch of people who never care about free speech on campus, except when they care about the particular opinion that's being expressed, suddenly be like, where's FIRE on what's going on at Columbia in terms of free speech? And it's like, hold on, there has been violence on campus since October 7th. There have been assaults of students. There have been unprecedented shoutdowns. There have been the deplatforming has gone completely off the rails. And what happened at NYU was that basically they tried to enforce the rule that you can't actually camp out on campus for extended periods of time. Like, that's not actually protected by the First Amendment. That's not considered freedom of speech. You can have rules saying that you can't actually turn the public part of a campus into a campground. And so there definitely are students that we've helped at both Yale and NYU who have gotten in trouble for pro-Palestinian speech. But there have also been a lot of cases where in the past several months we've seen actual threats. We've seen actual incitement threats, as in, like, I'm going to kill you, actual discriminatory harassment, and then other things that simply aren't protected as if they should be. And what I think is amazing is that the same students who think that it's absolutely outrageous that they're getting their campgrounds shut down are oftentimes the same ones who are actually literally doing the shout downs when it's speakers they don't like. And I mean that literally. When we looked at the shout downs, on campus, we found that, yes, there have been pro-Palestinian professors and students who have gotten in trouble. But when it comes to the shout-downs, it has been exclusively pro-Israel speakers who have been shouted down on campus over the past 6 months. Exclusively. And it's been overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian agitators who've been doing that. Which, we're happy to, you don't have to be good on free speech for us to defend your free speech, but we would appreciate people trying to be at least a little consistent. And this is a quote from Alan Charles Kors about what's at stake. A nation that does not educate in liberty will not long endure in liberty and will not even know when it's lost. So sorry if that has been a little bit of a depressing talk. But I think it's really important to lay it all out there to explain why I think this problem is so hard to fix and why I think that everyone, even if you never set foot on a campus ever again after leaving Baylor, you should still be concerned about it because it undermines our ability to have shared facts as a country, and that is a dangerous situation to be in. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
We have a couple of microphones, and I can pass the microphone to you, or you can come up here if you would like. Yeah. Let me get this gentleman first, and then students first, professors. Okay.
So how much do you think these issues are from social media and technology becoming more and more popular versus in the past when it was when people had to look at the news or they had to write something, they actually had to publish something or, read like a reputable article on the news or something like that. But now it's like you can scroll through X or something and just see whatever you want.
Yeah, I think that social media has sped up a lot of existing trends. And certainly when it comes to polarization was already going in a bad direction for, actually pretty much a substantial portion of my life. And it was definitely bad before we noticed the big social media explosion around 2012. 2012 is significant because it's the year that a majority of young people actually had social media in their pocket. And it's one of the things that Haidt and I talk about in Coddling in the American Mind as being one of the reasons why we think there's been a big increase of anxiety and depression among particularly young women, but also young people, is because growing up in an environment where you're constantly in the fishbowl of social media is extremely unpleasant. And we talk about this in Coddling in the American Mind as well. It also allows for runaway homophily, which is the tendency of like people to want to be around like people, which means that I think some of the depression effects are partially depressed people are finding each other, and it turns out if you get a big group of depressed people without any non-depressed people in that circle, they tend to get more depressed. Tragically, I guess not so tragically, but it's the same with happy people. It's kind of like if a large group of happy people with just happy people in it tend to get happier, which somehow just seems unfair. So I do think social media has sped up a lot of pre-existing trends. I also think it's created some unique phenomena, things like Tumblr, for example, and places that reward outrage. And social media, when it comes to creating the opportunity for cancel culture, has been very much, probably you couldn't really have cancel culture without social media to the scale at which we have it. Because usually, like if you hated a writer, at the New York Times, you would write a letter, you'd type up a letter and mail it in, and it would end up in someone's drawer somewhere. In the age of social media, when you hated a writer, you could suddenly make it look like 5,000 people think this person is outrageous and needs to go, even if it ends up being, 5 people, some with a lot of sock puppet accounts, So social media was very responsible for the acceleration in cancel culture because a lot of it just wasn't practical until you could create sort of super flash mobs. When it comes to some of the polarization aspects, I do think it sped a lot of it up. When it comes to the misinformation, disinformation thing, I get more worried about the cure for misinformation and disinformation in many ways than I do about the problem of misinformation and disinformation itself. I think that I see that it gets waved about as like, oh, but we need a top-down solution to the problem of misinformation, disinformation, which to me seems a excuse for massive potential government control over of deciding what is and is not true. So I do think social media has sped up a lot of these trends. I think it's created social cancel culture as we know it. And while certainly it comes with serious and disruptive problems as well, I do think that some of the proposed cures for social media are even worse.
Thank you, Greg. That was a great talk. I have a question about one of the other kinds of pressures. I thought you did a great job of sort of outlining the different, sort of the gauntlet that one will go through in the history of one's academic journey. But I think of two others. One is the sort of collective signing of academic units. So let's say you have a situation where, you know, let's say the Department of Chemistry, and there's 30 members, and the chair sends out an email to everybody and says, you know, there's this social question that our community is wrestling with, and I want us all to sign on and make a public statement. Yeah. And then there's the one assistant professor who just got hired who is skeptical. Now he or she is in a position where if they don't sign it, their absence from that list is pretty conspicuous. Yeah. Or in the other kind of case is the one where the dean or the president or the provost issues a public statement on a contested question, and then you're a faculty member who may do academic work in this area and disagree. And now you wonder, well, when I'm up for tenure, up for promotion or a raise or a grant, will that count against me? So I'm just wondering if you could comment on those phenomena.
No, it's a great question. So one of the things that FIRE recently got very much behind is something that I came in fairly skeptical of when I started back in 2001. And so for those of you who don't know, there are a number of academic freedom policies that go by names like the 1915 statement, AAUP 1940 statement, the Woodward Report. That are all excellent statements on academic freedom, what it means. And I very much supported those. But there was something that came out of the University of Chicago in 1967 called the Calvin Report. And in a time when there was all this pressure on university campuses coming from protesters to say, you know, like, you're either with us or against us. I mean, like, as a free speech person, a lot of times people think I must have thought of like the 60s as a golden age for a lot of this stuff, and I don't. A lot of it was, particularly on campus, attempts to bring politics into environments where it didn't necessarily belong and to pressure their universities to toe the line to what the student activists wanted. And one school that actually said, nope, we're not doing that, was University of Chicago in 1967. And they said that this university is the host to the critic, it is not itself the critic. So institutionally, we are not going to take positions on political matters that have nothing to do with the university. And they stuck by it. And FIRE now actually endorses the Calvin Report for schools across the country. Because what I didn't fully appreciate was this idea. Because basically, like, in a situation where, let's say, like, a group of students have like an offensive party. I'm actually thinking of a particular case where students literally had a party where the goal was to be as offensive as possible. And the president of Pennsylvania State University just decides to bash them, you know, but then say, but that's First Amendment protected. You know, I'd be willing to take that. It's better than them getting punished, you know, and they've got to appease, you know, the angry students in some way. But the more I saw universities not being able to cabinet even to things that happen on campus, it increasingly became things relating to the election, you know, like deciding, like in 2016, that it was basically a day of mourning because Trump got elected. What was something that, you know, on campus, that was a pretty popular move on a lot of campuses, and a lot of students were also appropriately kind of horrified. And then when it became issues like, I'm very pro-Ukrainian, but I was pretty horrified to see a lot of university presidents come out, you know, saying this university supports Ukraine, and it's like, you know, you shouldn't have a foreign policy. Like you're a university here, and And every time they did that, they were kind of implicitly sending messages to researchers that, well, you know, maybe this place isn't really for you, and maybe you could conform. And so we've become fans of the Calvin Report for schools across the country, what's called institutional neutrality. I also support departmental neutrality, where essentially your English department deciding that everybody in this department has to be, you know, anti-Israel. And I say that as if that sounds so fanciful, but believe me, I'm seeing a lot of that right now. That is a conformity-inducing pressure. That junior professor who was afraid to say what they really think won't be saying what they really think. And that senior professor, that tenured professor, you know, might actually be looking for a new job pretty soon, I've found, because tenure doesn't provide that much of a protection anymore. So I definitely believe in institutional neutrality, and I believe in departmental neutrality, because we need fewer mechanisms by which you can pressure professors to toe a political line that has nothing to do with what their discipline should be about. Or even, and actually it's even worse if you want them to toe a political line when their discipline is about it.
We have several other questions, but can I take the moderator's privilege and push you a little bit on this institutional neutrality point?
Yep.
In two ways. One is, could you comment on, you know, sort of borderline or difficult cases with institutional neutrality? For example, in, was it 2017, 2018, when the Trump administration imposed restrictions on travel to the United States from 7 Muslim majority countries. Some universities and even a professional organization that I'm involved with wanted to issue statements denouncing this immigration policy on the grounds that it makes it impossible for us to perform our function as a university or as a professional association if people from certain countries can't attend our meetings. In you know, with COVID policy, for example, you know, COVID in the U.S. and in other countries too quickly became heavily politicized. Now, you could argue the university has responsibility to maintain, you know, to try to figure out the appropriate kind of public health protocols for dealing with a situation like that to function as a university. But should the university favor one treatment or another, or should the university support lockdowns or oppose them when these things quickly became more than purely scientific or technical issues, but kind of heavily politicized issues? Is it possible to be institutionally neutral when everything is politicized?
Yeah, I think that the fear of institutional neutrality forgets sometimes that your professors and your students are, you know, considered to be the main free speech actors there, and they're going to have a lot to say on all of those issues, and they have every right to say them. And you have to trust and believe that your students can actually handle this in a way that it doesn't have to be the president of Harvard leading the way here. Now, when it comes to places that I actually thought handled October 7th well, for example, I thought University of Virginia did a great job when it expressed concern for their students who are actually over there. And they didn't say anything more than that. You know, it was like, great, okay, that's bringing it back to something that's of direct relevance. It's one of the things that happens sometimes with some of the BDS legislation. You know, for example, when you're saying that we're not going to take professors from Israel, for example, to point out that that actually has really serious ramifications for academic freedom, and that's considered actually directly hostile to the canons of academic freedom. So you can figure out ways to sort of bring it back to something that affects the university community directly. But even that I am a little bit sort of leery of, because, you know, how quickly people turn an exception into an exception you can drive a truck through when you're trying, and really what I think in a lot of cases they need to do is trust in their professors and their students to make their voices heard, but not to put a thumb on the scale from the university as much as they can restrain themselves as possible.
Almost every university I know, including this one, every university president, including ours, made a George Floyd statement in 2020. Is that directly relevant to the functioning of the university? It's kind of a question mark, I guess.
And that's one of the things. It's like once you start doing it, it becomes really hard to stop. And I do actually think that there are some administrators out there who started to look at this and be like, what if we never had to do this again? Because every time we do it, we're expected to do it more and stronger, and then our double standards are pointed out to us, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And the idea being like, no, like our professors can speak for themselves, our students can speak for themselves. We are the host to the critics, not the critic itself, as they say in the Calvin Report.
First off, I want to say I've been a huge fan of FIRE's advocacy efforts on campuses and whatnot.
Thank you.
And I know there's been a lot of discourse online just about in the astronomical rise in the number of just college administrators compared to professors. But I was kind of curious, how much of this free speech issue can be even really tied to the faculty job market itself? I was reading this interesting paper a few months back. I don't remember by who, but it showed that in like the humanities and like fields like history, a significant percentage of the new hirings and the number of jobs that were listed are all tied specifically to like quote unquote like critical race scholars or like critical politics. So how much of that is just universities inviting more of these ideological controversies?
Yeah, I feel like what we're facing in higher ed, to a degree, and I want to say this in like as neutral a way as possible, are problems of institutional decay. And what I mean by that is when an institution has been around for a long time, there's a tendency for it to sort of lose the plot and to become more bloated, to become, by various measures, more corrupt. And that's a problem, and you have to figure out ways that those institutions can renew. And I feel like the chance to sort of set things right in higher ed, might have been missed decades ago for a lot of this, particularly when you started having departments that explicitly viewed themselves as having a political identity. What was part of the problem, and that's actually one of the reasons why some of the original people who objected to some of the studies departments, for example, that was actually the reason why Harvard didn't have studies departments until the late 1990s, was partially because they were like, these are explicitly political, they self-define their mission as being political. So that was a problem to begin with. Now, to the extent to which the problem is administrators, that's definitely part of the problem. I think John Arnold, a billionaire from Houston, just tweeted numbers for Pomona College in California, where it's a 17% increase in students, a negative 3% increase in tenured professors, and a 434% increase in administrators at Pomona. And we see things like that all over the country. And it's absolutely the case at FIRE. The people that we fight the most tends to be mid-level administrators. And that's one of the reasons why, we definitely run into good administrators all the time who are mad at us for that we're always so hard on the administrators. It's like, but I'm sorry, like that's like the major people that we fight. When it comes to explicitly like politicized positions, basically being like, we've seen, advertisements for professorships where it's basically saying, we're looking for an English professor of critical studies, and then essentially listing what that professor should believe. And it's like, that's insane. And would never be tolerated by a previous generation, but somehow like we've gotten there. And how exactly you fix that is hard, because one of the things that has been really standard in analysis of academic freedom is that the best way to protect academic freedom, the rule has been, is to let the department decide whether or not this professor is engaged in good pedagogy and let the department uphold ethical and pedagogical standards. But some departments have done a terrible job of this, and they've mostly been replicating people that they agree with. And how exactly you fix that is something that we're wondering a lot about, because it's not an easy fix. But I feel like we're headed towards a precipice here, because it's like when you look at the most influential schools in the country, and I say this, I mentioned Stanford. I'm a Stanford grad, and I went there as a lower income kid. And I never forgave that school for how many people I ran into who suddenly thought I was a legitimate human being because I had a degree from there. Like it struck me as gross, because I was not smarter by virtue of going there. And there were a lot of people that I grew up with who were working on, working as auto mechanics, who were just as smart as the people I went to law school with. And now you're talking about a situation in which Columbia, for example, you can expect to pay about $95,000 a year to go to Columbia at this point. You're mostly paying for administrators, but you're also paying for a ticket to the upper class, essentially. And that's messed up. So I think that we're in an unsustainable situation. People don't trust higher ed, at least a lot of institutions at this point. And I think that our sort of educated class is kind of in denial of how bad it's actually gotten. So I spent a lot of time thinking about potential reforms, but like in canceling the American Mind, the very first one I started with was a lot fewer jobs need to require a BA. Like that's how bad I think the situation is. Baylor's great though.
So the two-part question, perhaps a little bit related, but number one, what is your view of state laws like we have in Texas now and also North Carolina that prohibit public universities from having DEI departments?
Yeah.
And then secondly, as someone who's midly on the left, why do you think, slightly to the left, as you said yourself, why do you think so many on the left have abandoned the whole notion of civil libertarianism?
Yeah.
And you'll find actually more conservatives now who actually take up these causes than what it used to be. What do you attribute that to?
Well, the two very different questions. There's actually even someone on our advisory council who wrote something talking about all of these laws that are being passed all over the country that are restricting the academic freedom rights of public universities. And I was like, there's one that I know of, which was the Stop Woke Act, and we defeated it in court. What are you talking about? And he was talking about the laws that are restricting whether or not you can have DEI administrative offices. And it's like, no, a state school system can decide to eliminate those, and a state legislature can decide to not pay for extra administrators who are jacking up the cost. And by the way, and I say this every chance I get, a lot of those administrators are threats to academic freedom and free speech. A lot of those same administrators are the ones who, literally, some of those shout downs that I talk about, they were organized in some cases by DEI administrators. So it's like, no, this is like saying, it's like, well, we have academic freedom. We have to maintain our anti-academic freedom department. We have to maintain our censorship department at this school. So it's like, I am actually for, because getting rid of a lot of these departments. The problem is if you just call them DEI offices, though, they're just going to change the name of it. They're just going to change it to something else. They're just going to change it to belonging. And the problem will repeat. As long as you have departments where basically there's an idea of acceptable pedagogy and we're here to police that, that's already the problem. Now, when it comes to what happened to the left, I have a little bit of a view that's very much a Gen X view, because growing up in the 90s, the left, I proudly call myself a liberal, but the left had kind of turned itself into something not taken all that seriously by the 90s, particularly if it was the kind of left that actually still thought, communism was great, Marxism was great, all these kind of ideas that by the fall of the Soviet Union and by the attempted liberalization of China, it all seemed like, okay, well, we figured out what happened there, and all those people on campus like Herbert Marcuse and the critical theory people who were very proudly, Marcuse himself was very pro-Maoist. He was pro-Mao, for goodness sakes, and that seemed largely discredited. So there was nothing inconsistent about being very hard on the left, but still seeing yourself as a liberal. And what's happened is that the left has come back with a vengeance, and the sort of liberal left is still the majority of people who are left of center, but we're less and less important to the Democratic Party. We're less and less important on campus. We are more marginalized. Meanwhile, when you look at kind of like polling, it's the center left and the center right that hasn't lost their minds. And that they tend to be good on free speech, they tend to be good on civil liberties, but the populist right and the kind of, forgive the expression, woke left, has kind of spread out in its own way. But the edges seem to be much more influential than the middle at the moment. And I think it's one of the reasons why Americans are so unenthused about our political choices, in this upcoming election, is because a lot of us don't, the big middle of the United States doesn't really see themselves very much reflected in their politics in any candidate. So I actually appreciate the fact that a lot of the people I disagree with increasingly call themselves progressives, because historically speaking, progressivism was a much more centralized historical movement. It was much more kind of like the best and the smartest people will get together and they'll use state power in order to improve the lot of the country. This was very much the kind of person Woodrow Wilson was, for example. He thought he was smarter than everybody else and he was a horrible racist. And he believed in state power because he was smarter than everybody else. And that's one of those things where it's, I appreciate it when people don't call that aspect of the left liberal. Those are progressives, but still, unfortunately, liberal is used synonymously with left, and I don't really want much to do with that. But I do think that the reassuring part is it's good to know that if you look at the center, a left or right, that they are still really good on free speech and civil liberties and all these kind of things. The depressing part is that the center, is not feeling very politically powerful at the moment. And I also don't think that's a sustainable situation.
Good question.
Sure.
For one, I just want to say thank you. I feel like you brought a lot of ideas that I really haven't thought about, and at the same time, I really need to, considering the setting that I'm in. But one thing that really stuck to me, considering that setting, is that the idea of institutional neutrality.
Yeah.
I just want to know, how do you say how does the school approach that? Because I feel like there's so many aspects a part of being an institution that causes them to have to say something. Yeah. Because one of the things that you were talking about is academic freedom. I feel like professors, a big part of their job is to talk about the things that they experience, and sometimes those things that they experience aren't necessarily things that everybody agrees with, but it's something that probably everybody should hear just because they've gone through it, we haven't. Some people may be offended, but at the end of the day, it may help you, and they may not realize. But given the school, and given academic freedom, if a professor says something like that, but it causes an uproar on that campus, I feel like the school will be bound to have to say something for the sake of keeping the peace and things like that. But at the same time, this is just not with schools, and it's just, I feel like it's things or people with platforms in general. I feel like there's so many aspects and so many characteristics that's gonna be forced for people to have to say something. So how do you say somebody keeps a neutral mindset and a neutral platform without necessarily bending against or bending towards the other way?
I don't think it would necessarily be, because institutional neutrality is generally about politics off campus. It is primarily what you're talking about. But I do think that in a situation where a professor says something, offensive on campus, I think that it's completely inappropriate for the university president to come out and say, we condemn this professor if you believe in academic freedom. That's basically saying, like, what they should be getting in the habit of saying is, like, listen, academic freedom, everyone is free to disagree as much as they want with this. Students are free to protest. Professors are free to let what they think be known. But as an academic institution, we have to foster free speech. We have to have high tolerance even for offensive speech and for academic freedom. And I think that universities have gotten out of the habit of defaulting to that. I think if they got back into the habit of defaulting to that, they'd find it actually is rather freeing and can actually create a better intellectual environment, and they'd actually not have to always be guessing about like what the crowd wants them to say, like they do right now. But I think that a lot of the concern about that a university president has to say something is something that has been sort of a snowball effect, that essentially they say one thing many years ago, next thing you know, they're giving large talks about the scourge of fat phobia. A lot of these things start relatively small and then they progress in a way. And I think that it seems hard to imagine right now university presidents saying, listen, that's not something we have a formal position on. It sounds so alien because it's been so little practiced for such a long time. But I think if universities got back in the habit of doing it, they'd find it not as difficult to draw those distinctions as it sometimes seems.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Yeah, so I loved your talk. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your consistency across the political spectrum.
I couldn't tell if you were mad at me for saying mean things about Woodrow Wilson or support.
No. It was nice to see you calling out illiberalism on both sides of the center. But I'm thinking more about institutional neutrality. And at Baylor, we are private. We do have a Christian mission, and sometimes the university feels led to step in on all sorts of issues. life would be one of those issues, say pro-life issues. And so I wonder, you know, is that notion of political neutrality, is it eliminated, is it sort of relegated in your mind to non-sectarian private institutions and public institutions, or should it be all universities? And if so, why?
That's a great question. I definitely think I'd put it at like different levels. That essentially, I think state schools that are bound by the First Amendment, I think tomorrow, I think probably even the federal government could do this. They could say, listen, institutional neutrality is the rule. You're supposed to be at institutes of learning. You're supposed to be radically open-minded. I think they could institute that tomorrow if they wanted to. When it comes to private non-sectarian colleges, I think that's a very good rule to have institutional neutrality. And I think that some of these, given how there are very few schools in the country that actually don't receive massive amounts of federal funding, I don't think it's beyond the pale of consideration that some of these kind of rules that apply currently to state schools will start applying to private schools as well, except for the ones who don't receive lots of public funding. Now, of course, the ones that don't receive lots of public funding include schools that are also sectarian, or religious schools like Hillsdale, for example, that doesn't take public funding. When it comes to religious schools, definitely there's a long tradition of allowing special rules for religious schools, and particularly as they relate to that school's religious mission. I think that it's understandable. Certainly there would be no legal reason why a university couldn't, a private sectarian school couldn't actually say, we have positions on abortion, for example. And I think that would be something that they would have institutional, they'd actually have First Amendment freedom of association to actually engage in that. That would actually be a pretty strong claim there. But I do think that being as restrained about it as possible to not create an orthodoxy if you want to have a proper university where people really feel like they can pursue their research as they see fit is good and smart and wise. So certainly it turns more into that situation to a can but should situation. They do have a freer hand to do that. I think that they should still be as restrained as they can tolerate.
I think this may be our last question of the night.
All right, a quick question about fire and then a broader question. So so I teach I'm a community college professor, and is there any evidence that this translates to kind of smaller community college settings in terms of the same point of contention? Because one of the reasons I stopped teaching at universities is because I couldn't find apartments that I felt comfortable in.
Yeah.
And I've personally found more safety in a community college environment. So that's the first question.
Okay, let me answer the first one first. It depends on the community college. We've definitely seen some really, really bad abuses at some community colleges, and that's partially because since there is less media coverage sometimes in community colleges, and sometimes because they're publicly funded but don't get a ton of media, and they're not as reliant on like alumni donations. We've had situations where we've been in lawsuits with community colleges where they just don't care about students' free speech rights or faculty's free speech rights, because they're like, what are you going to do? Sue us? Who cares? Like we don't pay for that. So definitely we've seen some pretty bad community colleges, but that depends on the particular community college.
All right. And then my kind of more personal, practical question. So obviously there's some issues with kind of the administration and larger picture, but in terms of like educating in the classroom, so I teach speech communication, I teach argumentation and debate, which is terrifying because then I actually have to give like two sides, and I have personal experience. I'll give two sides and the course evaluations will indicate that they totally forgot about the other side. And so do you have any practical advice in terms of approaching education in a classroom setting for faculty members, but also to encourage students? Like when we're trying to encourage the next generation, and like, how do you teach viewpoint diversity in cancel culture in a healthy way that also hopefully protects that vulnerability that I experience too, because I'm forcing them to engage with exactly what that concern.
Yeah, you have to teach it early and often, and it has to be part of orientation. Like FIRE actually has its own free speech orientation where we explain academic freedom, but a lot of administrators, depending on how political the campus is, they're not just shy, they're downright hostile to actually saying like, listen, saying things like I say all the time, like being offended is what happens if you have your deepest beliefs challenged. And if you make it through 4 years without having been offended, you should demand your money back, because that means you might not have been taught. And I think that universities, that needs to be explained in orientation, that needs to be explained on the first day of class. I think that you need to repeat that over and over again, so students, will still probably forget that in a debate class, it's kind of like, well, he made the wrong, he took the wrong side of affirmative action, for example. He gave the opinion that I hate the most on that. Where at least it's been repeated to them enough to be kind of like, no, but the whole exercise is being able to engage in thought experimentation, engage in devil's advocacy, so at least they can say that they've been taught it. Because so many times I feel like when students are bad actors for free speech, I have some sympathy for them, because that's what they've been taught. They've been taught to call the bias-related incident program when a professor has wrongthink. And they haven't been taught the much more difficult and much more counterintuitive idea that being offended can be good for you, that thought experimentation is good, devil's advocacy is key to the production of better ideas. And these are the kind of things that, one, they have to be explained over and over again, but they also have to be demonstrated. And one way they could take some of the flack off you is by not just having that explained in orientation, but by having exercises that require people to take views contrary to the ones they actually hold. Because once you actually are put in that situation, as certainly you should have the experience before law school, if God forbid you should go to law school. But the extent to which, how hard it is to ever again think that your opponent has to be stupid or evil once you've actually had to make their arguments for them, and then what you realize every time you actually have to switch that is you start convincing yourself that the other side might actually be right. So I think there's lots that your school could do, but they have to start early and often.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and please join me in thanking Greg for his excellent and stimulating talk.